This week on Dig Me Out.
They're the kind of band I think you'd probably describe as like, instead of all the things they are, you describe them more as all the things they aren't.
Tim and Jay review Stoner Witch by the Melvins.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Dig Me Out. I'm your host, Tim Minichi, and joining me once again, my co-host, Mr. Jason Ziak. Jay?
Yes.
Yes! Welcome to the program, Jay. Issue number 1.
Yes.
Thanks for joining the round table of 2. I guess you could still have a round table with only 2 people. It's just the shape of the table.
Yeah,
So
the what's his name? Rose shows like that.
Is it?
What's his name?
Charlie Rose?
Charlie Rose show. I think he sits at a round table, but it's just 2 people.
Yeah.
Can be done.
It can be done. Jay, lots of things can be done. And one of those things that can be done is making really heavy music.
Jeez.
How's that for a segue?
Oh, so awful.
King of the segues. Jay, this week we are going to talk about a band that makes heavy music. They're called Melvins, or the Melvins, however you want to add the at the beginning. Just Melvins is fine, or the Melvins. We're going to talk about their album from 1990, I believe, 4, as the albums that we are reviewing are mostly from. In this year, we're trying to hit the 20-year mark, and we're going to talk about their album Stoner Witch, which is another album came out the same year. They put out albums on 2 different record labels during the same year. So this was the second. This was on the when they had their major label deal. This came out on the major label, and the other one came out on an indie label. So we'll get into all that. But Jay, tell me about your background when it comes to Melvins. Are you a Melvins aficionado, or have you just sort of sampled them from time to time, or completely unfamiliar?
Mostly sampled. They're one of those bands where they've influenced so many other bands that we probably both like, and a lot of our listeners like. You feel obligated to, from time to time, after hearing interviews with some of the bands you like, to go back and give those bands a chance. So I've done that from time to time. I think I got an album, maybe one of their more recent releases, recent being within like the last 10 years.
Right.
Nude with Boots was one that I bought. And I also got, I'm always a fan of different forms of metal at some point. And sometimes my interest in that is, more intense than others. And during one of my more intense periods of metal, trying to get into new bands and find new stuff, I, spent some time listening to them at that point, probably 5 or so years ago.
Gotcha.
So, yeah, I've been in and out of the band. I don't, I know some about them. I know that they have a Kiss fascination, which was probably another reason why I've given them, a listen throughout the years. I know that they were influential to Nirvana amongst a bunch of other bands, like I said. So that's pretty much it.
My experience, I have 2 experiences. My early experience with Melvins is actually not hearing the music, but in high school. So we're talking like 91, 92, when I was in high school in Ohio. I was one of those. So I went to Catholic school, just to back up. So I was a little sheltered during my grade school days. So going to high school, I didn't know a lot about, I guess you'd say, underground music. So I was mostly just listening to the radio and whatnot. And there was, when I moved out to Ohio, there was some, I guess you'd say, stoner guys who were into like metal and stuff like that. And they had like, the jackets with patches on them and stuff. stereotypical stoner metal, guys in bands with goatees and shaved
I was
heads.
one of those guys.
Yeah. So they had patches like AC/DC, and
Yeah.
one of them I remembered was the Melvins. They had one of the guys had a Melvins patch. So this is around 91, 92. And I remember just being afraid at that point to listen to the Melvins because I associated all that music with the devil and people who worship the devil. So it was like Sabbath, AC/DC, Melvins, whatever. I was like, well, that's way too heavy for me to ever listen to. My brain will explode if I try to listen to that music. And then once I got into college and Nirvana, and you sort of open your ears up, hopefully. And I heard some Melvins in college, and then it wasn't until with you as I sort of got more into heavier bands in the 2000s, when you hear bands like Mastodon or other of I guess what would you call? I guess there's a new wave of heavy metal in the 2000s. A lot of those bands reference the Melvins, and that made me go back and listen to a lot of stuff of theirs. Primarily the 90s stuff, the run like Stag, and there's a couple other ones that I checked out, but this was one of them that I sort of gave a brief listen to back then, and then I didn't revisit it. Although they've always been a band that I've been like, I gotta go listen to more of their stuff. So that's my background with Melvins. Let's talk about the Melvins' actual background and the history of the band.
History of the band.
So the Melvins were formed in around 1983 by Buzz Osborne, also known as King Buzzo, I think is also how he goes. Buzz Osborne on guitar and vocals. Matt Lukin was the original bass player who would go on to play in Mudhoney. And then Mike Dillard played drums. They all went to the same high school, junior high and senior high schools in Montesano, Washington. And in the beginning, they were just playing covers of Cream and Jimi Hendrix, and then they started to incorporate hardcore punk. Dillard left the band, and Dale Crover joined to take over the drums. And that's when they started rehearsing at Crover's house in Aberdeen, Washington. They started transforming into more of an original band, playing slower and heavier songs. Now, the band has a long history, and they have a lot of lineup changes, mostly at the bass player position. But they've incorporated a lot of different players over the years, and I'll get into that. They've also released 22 albums as the Melvins between 1987, when their first album was released, and 2014, where they just now have a new album coming out. It's called Hold It In, and it's, again, Osborne and Crover, but they're joined by Butthole Surfers members Paul Leary and Jeff Pincus. So, on this particular album that we're reviewing, Stoner Witch, Mark Dutram is the bass player, and he played on a number of albums in the 90s. So that's the truncated version of the history of the band for the Melvins. I didn't want to go release by release because we would literally be here for an hour going through all the releases, and that doesn't even include side project stuff, and he's done solo albums, and they've recorded with various other artists. So that would have taken a long time. So if you want to suggest an album for us to review, visit the request review page at digmeoutpodcast.com. We did get some Facebook feedback on this record. Scott Russell Hallgrim says, "Hells yes, Melvins is my favorite band, and this is probably in my top 5 albums of theirs. Sweet Willy Rollbar is probably my favorite song of theirs." followed that up with, I expect in 3 weeks you will be able to judge this album among the bank's catalog and said song among same. History of the band's going to take an hour itself. Well, we got around that, Scott, by not talking about any of the individual albums. That's called time saving. We're doing some time saving. And then Troy Colby says, such a great album and an all-time favorite band. I think I saw them 4 times on tour for this record. One of them was when they opened for Nine Inch Nails on the Downward Spiral tour. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So I know they had a lot of opportunities to open for big bands in the 90s, Nine Inch Nails being one of them. They also opened for Tool, on Tool's tour for, I want to say, Anima, which was the big album that came out with Stinkfist and a bunch of other songs. That was like the one that sort of, I think, got them more of a mainstream audience, if Tool ever went mainstream. I don't know. But it was after Undertow. I know that. So that's the history and Facebook feedback for Melvins. One note on this record, the producer is legendary metal and rock producer G.G. Garth, or Garth Richardson, who we have encountered before. He did the Curb Dog on the Turn record, which we were both fans of, I believe. That's going back to like season 1 or 2. I don't remember which one that was. That was a couple years ago. Back in the early days.
So he's done Biffy Clyro. 3 albums by them, who I like a lot. Chevelle. I'm just calling out the bands I know. Gallows. I love them. I love that record. Grey Britain. Jesus Lizard. Curb Dog. Kick Tracy. Interesting. It was a late entry in the glam metal era. L7. Mudvayne, Melvins. Nickelback. Red Hot Chili Peppers. Rage Against the Machine. A lot of stuff on here. Ugly Kid Joe. And most importantly, White Lion's Pride.
Most importantly. So
wow,
I mentioned that
all those albums sound dramatically different.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I mentioned that so this album came out on Atlantic in October of 1984. They also released in August of 1994 the album Prick. That was released on Amphetamine Reptile Records. They had a contract with Atlantic, and this was their experimental, or Prick was an experimental record, much more noise based. And King Buzzo or Buzz Osborne said that Prick is, quote, a total noise crap record, and we did it strictly for the weirdness factor, complete and utter nonsense, a total joke. So in order to release it on Amphetamine Reptile, Melvins is written backwards, is how they got away with it. So there you go. So that album was released, to for whatever reason, is a joke in August, and then they followed that up, a couple months later with Stoner Witch. And this followed Houdini, which was released in '93 on Atlantic. And that album, you mentioned Kiss, Jay, features a cover of Going Blind by Kiss. So there you go.
Interesting. Okay. So them and Dinosaur Jr. covered that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
I should check that version out. I've never heard that.
So let's talk about the record. Let's talk about Stoner Witch and what we liked, what we didn't like, what worked for us, and what did not work. Jay, I'm going to start out because I think I had you start out last week with electronic, and I know that was difficult for you.
I'm still recovering. Thank you.
You're still recovering from that, so I'm going to give you a little more time. I'm going to start out with what worked for me on this record, and I'm going to start out with Dale Crover, the drummer. I mean, his status is kind of legendary at this point in terms of being a hard-hitting drummer, but there are entire songs where I am completely entranced by his drumming. Mm-hmm. Roadbull, track 6, it starts out with a full band, and then it just drops out, and it's just him, and you're just like mesmerized by these. He's just doing like drum and or kick and snare stuff, and it's just, I'm just like entranced. I'm just like listening to it, like It's so simple, yet he's just got this awesome groove going on, and he does that in the aforementioned Sweet Willy Rollbar, and there's a Junebug, the instrumental track 10. There are just track after track of him just pounding the drums. I'm sure that if you're a, super technical drummer aficionado, you're probably not in love with him because he's not doing all these crazy Neil Peart, Mike Portnoy type things, but he's just doing these really cool time shift fills and just crushing the drums in a way that sounds so big and so loud that you just become like transfixed on him. So that to me is the first thing that worked for me on this record, which is Dale Crover.
Yeah, he's deceptively technical, I think. He does do some fills on here where it's like, it sounds like a machine gun, it's like, like,
yeah,
definitely somebody knows what they're doing. So like Roadbull, where it breaks down, it's just kick and snare. There's like a, he like hesitates. Like he's like a little behind and a little in front on some of the stuff on purpose, and it creates this tension of like, and the pattern is varied so that, you're like, oh, this is going to be 2 snare hits and it's 1. And you're like, oh, okay, the next one's going to be 1 and it's 2. And you know what I mean? Like you can't, that's what makes it interesting to me is you can't predict what he's going to do, but it's not to the point where it's like, mathematically hurting your mind to try to wrap your head around what's going on. It's just
right.
This clever use of very simple ideas, but it makes that makes it interesting. Plus, he just hits really hard, which always sounds good,
Yes.
So, yeah, I think he's the most interesting part about this band from this album I've listened to and some of the others I've listened to.
Another thing that worked for me is the variety that's on this record. I've sampled, like I said, a number of different, mostly 90s records for Melvins in the past. And the thing that I like about this record is there are elements of some of that old school Melvins sort of punk influenced 80s stuff. Then there are the sort of long drawn out weird freak out type things that might be, you might draw comparisons to like, I don't know, Captain Beefheart or other avant-garde sort of musicians. I'm thinking of like Magic Pig Detective has this 3.5 minute long intro that's really could have been its own song, and then it kicks into this sort of punk song after that. Shevel is real slow and moody, and same thing with Goose Freight Train. Goose Freight Train sounds like it could be out of a David Lynch film. Like it sounds like it's in Blue Velvet, and you're expecting Dennis Hopper to show up with his oxygen tank and start saying crazy shit. Like, and then you get like these almost southern rock corrosion of conformity riffs on like Queen and Revolve, and that almost has like a old school Metallica James Hetfield vocal thing going on for parts of it. And they're able to like really combine a lot of different sounds and a lot of different aspects of the different parts of this band. Whereas if I had to listen to a whole album of like Goose Freight Train and Sheevil and Lividity, I think I would probably lose my mind. But sprinkled in here and there and combined with all these big heavy riffs that Osborne and Crover are dialing up, it makes it sound like a more cohesive record. Like I understand more where the weirdness is coming from when the heaviness is there too.
Yeah, it was interesting. When I was listening to the record, as I was doing other things, I really didn't like those songs. I felt like in that context where I wasn't paying attention, I was just letting the music happen around me. I became impatient with those, or I would just totally phase out and forget I was even listening to the record. But when I were more, attentively reviewed it and did notes, I didn't mind it as much. Maybe because I understood the concept and I was more engaged on the ride. So I know that you don't always listen to music that way. It sort of needs to work on both levels. So there's a part of it, of that type of material and that approach for them that I'm not necessarily willing to say worked for me completely. It worked better when I paid attention, but it's certainly not what they do best. Mostly because a lot of it doesn't have drums in it. Those quieter parts, the drums are super minimal and it's mostly like bass, which is weird. And there's a lot of them on here. There's 1, 2, 3, like 4 songs like that on here. Or at least that one song where it's like 3.5 minutes of that, and then a upbeat punk style song afterwards. So that's one thing I didn't really care for. And it's weird in that the record starts off really, really strong and up tempo. Tracks 1 through 4 all hold together really well.
Yeah.
And then at 5, you sort of hit that weird Goose Freight Train song that's a little bit jazzy, too. And then it's like kind of a roller coaster ride up and down from that point, up tempo, quiet, up tempo, quiet, up tempo, quiet kind of thing. So I was definitely more into the beginning of the record than I was the whole of the end. Revolve, you mentioned Metallica. Yeah, in fact, I think that sequence, the vocal comes in there, sounds a lot like Black Era. Metallica. Like,
Mhm.
you told me that was like a demo from that album, like just played that little section for me, I would have believed you. I mean, it's even got that like that kind of groove that record has, where it's breaking thrash metal down into more of a little bit slower kind of groove oriented approach.
Butt rock.
And yeah, and the vocal style on that sounds a lot like Headfilled. How do you describe? I was trying to describe the way that he sings. I couldn't come up with a good term for it, especially when he gets more aggressive, because it's not like screaming. It's not. What is it?
Urgency.
It's kind of like huh?
He's more urgent.
Yeah, but it's just kind of stylistically. I was trying to come up with a way to say what he's doing, and I had a hard time describing it. It's like a growl, or
Yeah, there's a bit of a growl.
That vocal style, I don't quite know how to describe it. But
Yeah,
I was surprised on the production who you said produced it, because to me all their records always sound the same. Like, they have a very unique way of mixing the band. Like, they'll float instruments around quite a bit. Like, bass sometimes will be in the middle, sometimes it'll be panned more. They'll do the same thing with drums. Like, I'll notice sometimes drums are in the middle and then sometimes drums are panned, and they have a very distinct sound. Like, I feel like I could know their records just on the drum sound alone. So, like, sometimes you'll hear a distortion. I don't know if that's added distortion or the mic's peaking or what on the drums, and they sound like the cymbals, like the hi-hat sounds like a really distinct, like a shaker almost, or something, like a distant kind of wispy sound, as opposed to being like more like big washy a tone, which is just makes the band sound, all that stuff mixed together with the way it's mixed. They don't use a lot of guitar overdubs, I noticed too, which is interesting because the album sounds huge.
Mm-hmm.
But when you break it down, for the most part, it's just like a drummer hitting really hard with a very distinct drum tone and one guitar and bass. Like, that's it. They're not doubling the guitar. He might overdub some leads or something here and there, but it's really pretty basic.
It's really stripped down. I mean, It's pretty amazing how big and full everything sounds. I mean, that's probably the credit to both them as players, and then Garth Richardson as a producer, getting that full of a sound. But as you mentioned, they kind of sound full on a lot of the records. Mm-hmm. I think that you mentioned about the first 4 tracks. I wonder if that was maybe not a conscious thing, but or maybe more subconscious, a recognition that this was a major label record, and it's like you come out with basically 4, I don't want to say straightforward, but for the Melvins, probably 4 of the more straightforward metal, hard rock songs that they, could write, in terms of Queen, especially Queen, Sweet, Willy, Rollbar, and Revolve. You put those 3 in a row. Then like you said, then the album gets weird after that, and you kind of don't know where it's going. But to start out the record like that, I mean, I'm kind of wondering if like they made the other album Prick to sort of get all that stuff out of their system, and then they're like, all right, well then these are the songs for the major label release, so that they could still put out a video, and they could still have it take a shot. I have a really
hard time though with them saying, essentially, they know they put an album out that was bullshit. Like, wouldn't you feel bad about people spending money on that? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I struggle with that too. Like, if you don't really believe in the music, why bother even now you can just put out for free on your website.
Yeah.
And just say, here's a download of some stuff that's bullshit, and if you want to listen to it.
Yeah. It's like people who, especially at that time, you wouldn't have gotten word that it was weird. You know what I mean? You would just known like, oh, there's a new Melvins record out. I love them. I'm going to go get the record. And you get it and be like, what the hell is this? And then have them not stand behind it and just be like, oh yeah, we were screwing around. It's like, well, dude, I just put $20 down on that.
Yeah. Yeah, that is kind of that's kind of a harsh move to pull.
Yeah.
especially when you
weird.
put it out in an indie label, and you know, if you get the first couple of reviews and people are like, this is a garbage record and this is pointless, you're not doing any favors for that indie label, like, unless you really dislike the people who run it.
Right.
So why do that? So it calls into a couple questions about what's the purpose behind putting a record you don't even believe in out.
Another thing I thought of quite a bit when I was listening to the band is the kind of band I think you'd probably describe as like, instead of all the things they are, you describe them more as all the things they aren't. Because they are a metal band in some ways, but they're not. I think of metal bands either being in one of two categories. Either they're singing about power or they're singing about anger.
Okay.
And they're not in one of those two often. Like they're almost like, they don't adhere to one of those two areas. And then they kind of have a sense of humor about them in a weird way. Like, I don't think they write joke songs, but do you get that like sense? I don't know if that's just my like knowing of their image and thing and stuff, projecting that, but I just get a little bit of a sense of like either a sense of humor or they don't totally take themselves seriously, in some small way. Do you get a sense of that, or?
Yeah, and it's probably from projecting what sort of we know about the band and having seen interviews with Buzz Osborne and knowing that he's a bit of a character and has a sense of humor about stuff. It makes me think of the Hype documentary, and he's in there quite a bit talking about the Seattle scene. He has a lot of funny stuff to say about the Seattle music scene. Legend has it that he's responsible for basically helping Nirvana come together as a band. Like, he introduced Kurt Cobain to Kirst Novoselic and Dave Grohl.
Mm-hmm.
So like he has this sort of like kind of legendary status to him as in terms of the whole 90s alternative rock and metal scene. And I think that's an important thing, is that this is a band that didn't necessarily start out being metal, and they sort of forged their own way, being a punk band and then playing really slow punk, and then that sort of morphing with the Black Sabbath influence and the thrash metal influences of Metallica and those bands from the 80s, and kind of forging their own weird path that it makes sense that they don't necessarily fit when you're trying to describe them as a metal band into any of those sort of metal specific categories, because they weren't born out of being a metal band. They started out as something different and sort of morphed into that, and have, in a lot of ways are their own sort of subcategory of metal.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard them reference as sludge pop in a review. I'm pretty sure that's the first. It's the only band that's ever been referred to that.
I don't know about that.
Yeah,
I don't hear much pop here. I mean, there's a couple moments where Queen has a little bit of a hook, and Sweet Willy Rollbar has a little bit of a hook, but that's about it. Like, there's no attempt here to adhere to any other kind of pop format on any of the other material.
No, and they're not even sticking to it in terms of song structure or anything.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I would just call them sludge then.
Yeah. I mean, sludge makes the most sense to me. That sludge metal sort of subgenre of metal makes the most sense in terms of like, this is a band that's willing to play real slow and real heavy. And you don't get that out of sort of the mainstream metal bands. So, or more well-known metal bands.
Mm-hmm.
So let me ask you this: we haven't done this in a while, but this was backed by Atlantic. They had big fans in Nirvana. Unfortunately, Kurt Cobain was dead at this point, but before this, they had put out Houdini and other records. Melvins never caught on as a mainstream, act. Mm-hmm. Do you think that if this was coming out today in the land of the new alternative metal scene, that this would fare better, or is this just still too weird?
Oh, good question. I think it would do much better. There's no doubt about that. I still feel like the quiet sections would need something else going on, the bands that we kind of talked about, the Mastodons and the Baronesses and those sorts of bands, Torch and all that sort of stuff, they'll get quiet, but there's almost like a little bit of a prog element there. In that there's usually some layering and gymnastics that eventually occur in some way, shape, or form. They don't go totally noise, or just atmospheric, and these guys kind of do that at times. So I think that part wouldn't quite work, but I think a lot of the rest of the record would be received pretty well, and I think still pretty original in terms of really just how they kind of construct things. It's just very unpredictable, I guess is the best way to say it. I think a lot of it comes out of the drumming, and I think it's sort of layered over top of everything else, or driven from that point with everything else in terms of they're able to mix it up, so you don't ever know where they're going to go next, or if the song is going to just end. Sometimes that happens too, where you're like, oh cool, they're building to something cool here, and it's like, nope, that's it, it's over. They just abruptly stop, like, okay, on to the next one. So I think it would work a lot better, or be a lot more successful than it probably was in the 90s. I think people will get it a lot more than they did then.
I think so as well. Let's talk about our overall ratings on this record, Jay. Worthy album, better EP, decent single. Where are you at?
It's a tough one. I'll say worthy album. I think it would be awesome at 8 tracks, even if you kept one of the slower, weird songs in here or something. But it just feels like that kind of band, you know what I mean? They should be at a 70s style, 40-minute, 8-track record. Even at 11, it just feels like, well, I mean, even 11, it's at 49 minutes. So if you could trim it back a little bit, I'd like it a lot more. But, it's easy enough to skip the couple of songs like that. Once you know which ones they are and you don't want to listen to background, like a backwards guitar for 4 minutes, you can just skip it. So, yeah, I mean, I'll give it a full worthy record.
I agree with you, and I agree with you on the number. I think if this was like 8 songs at like 36 minutes, it'd be killer.
Yeah.
I think you could drop Lividity and Sheevil right off the bat. Mm-hmm. Put them on an EP or a single by themselves.
Well, yeah, Lividity's 9 minutes, and Sheevil 6.5 minutes.
So there you go. Yeah,
I think if you look at the Sabbath and probably the bands that they're referencing, most of their records were like 4 songs on each side of the record. That's it, done.
Mm-hmm. I'm all about those 3 or 4, per side albums. Mm-hmm. Keep it tight and keep it short, and make people want more, not want to cut things off. Yep. So, but this is the CD era as well, so that's part of the reason. Yeah, so 2 worthy albums for the Melvins. Stoner Witch. As I mentioned, they have a new record out, so be sure to check that out. And this was episode 196, which means, Jay, you know what's going to happen next week? We're going to have episode 197.
No way.
Yeah.
It's weird how that works.
It is weird how that works. And for episode 197, believe it or not, Jay, we're going to be talking about another person who's got a new record out.
Oh, yeah?
In this case, it's Thurston Moore. He has Sonic Youth is no more, but he's putting out a new record with a new band. And we're going to talk about his first solo release, Psychic Hearts. So that's going to be an interesting one. Because I know a little bit of Sonic Youth stuff. I've pretty much sampled every record of theirs, but I wasn't really into a lot of the records except for a few of them. Some of the early 90s stuff, and then some of the more recent stuff I actually liked from the 2000s. That's about it. And I've only vaguely checked out his... I actually, the last time I listened to this record probably was college when we played it at the radio station, so it's going to be an interesting return for us.
He's thirsty for more music.
Thirsty for more. There you go.
I'm giving you your segue for next week.
Thanks, Jay, because I could use some work on those.
Sure.
If anyone out there would like to suggest a segue or an album, head on over to our request review page at digmeoutpodcast.com and request a review from us. And of course, if you like what you heard, please consider leaving us some positive feedback over at iTunes. For Jay, I'm Tim. That's a wrap. We'll be back next week with another episode of Dig Me Out.
Join the conversation about this episode at digmeoutpodcast.com, where you can find links to our Facebook page and Twitter feed, as well as links to our request a review and merchandise pages.